Und zwar werden wir jetzt unsere Englischkenntnisse spitzen. Ich mache euch, meinen Lieben, extra den Untertitel an, denn ich beherrsche Englisch natürlich perfekt. Für mich wäre das nicht nötig. Und jetzt werden wir vom Affen- und Kind-Experiment hören. Und ich glaube, das ist sehr horrormäßig.
Throughout history, stories of humans being raised by animals have fascinated mankind. The feral children have found their way into human culture throughout.
Tarzan, aber auch Romulus und Remus, ne? Romulus und Remus, die Gebrüder, die von einer Wölfin ernährt wurden und Rom erbaut haben. Oh mein Gott, lass mich raten, in diesem Experiment haben die versucht, dass ein Affe ein Kind erzieht. Oh mein Gott, die wollten wahrscheinlich Tarzan real life nachstellen. Oh, ich habe schon Angst. Früher war Wissenschaft wirklich so eklig und grausam. Und heute ist sie es immer noch, aber mit Tieren statt mit Menschen.
The ages from Tarzan all the way back to Romulus and Remus suckling from the she-wolf. Infants seemingly offer a blank slate upon which language, culture, nationality and morality are inscribed throughout their development. Because of this, child development is a miracle of learning, and as such, it has
Okay, es geht um Kindesentwicklung in diesem Experiment.
not only fascinated the likes of Rudyard Kipling, but also that of scientists. And one such scientist would devise an experiment, but instead of putting a child into the wild to be raised by animals, turn the tables and take one of our closest relatives of the animal kingdom and raise it as a human.
Ah, verstehe. Okay, das ist natürlich dann wahrscheinlich jetzt, wenn wir uns in der Nahrungskette betrachten, ethisch gesehen vertretbarer, als das mit einem Menschen zu machen. Andersrum, mit einem Affen, der in eine Familie geschleust wird. Für mich persönlich jetzt natürlich nicht, aber ihr wisst, was ich meine. Interessant.
Today we're looking at the ape and the child experiment. Welcome to the dark side of science.
Also das schlimmste Experiment, von dem ich mal gehört habe, war dieses, wo man gecheckt hat, ob Kinder vielleicht eine eigene Sprache entwickeln, wenn sie nie Kontakt zu anderen Menschen haben. Und die Kinder sind alle gestorben, weil denen der soziale Kontakt gefehlt hat.
Our story starts on the Abreu colony in Cuba in 1930 with the birth of a female chimpanzee on the 15th of November.
Lass mich raten, die ganze Familie wurde erstmal ermordet, um das Baby zu bekommen.
The baby chimp and her mother and father were donated to the Yerkes National Primate Research Centre not long after her birth. The research centre was headed by eugenicist Robert Yerkes and was used for medical research into comparative psychology. The baby chimpanzee was given the name Gua, and in June 1931 she was forcibly removed from her mother's cage and was sent off to a new home at the age of 7.5 months for a comparative experiment.
Aber das machen wir heute jeden Tag so mit Kälbern von Kühen.
Her new family was scientists Luella and Winthrop Kellogg and their 10-month-old son Donald.
Oh nein, und der wurde wahrscheinlich der Bruder vom Affen. Oh.
But before we carry on, here's some background information to the Kellogg's and why this young chimp became a resident in their house. Winthrop and Luella had married in 1920. The couple had met in Indiana University while studying. Winthrop was involved in a very diverse set of research subjects, but throughout the 1920s focused on conditioning and learning.
Aha, und das wollten die dem Affen wahrscheinlich dann in ihrer eigenen Familie beibringen.
He was fascinated with relative influence of nature and nurture on behaviour, and if you could isolate the nurture element. What if you could raise an animal, a primate for example, in the exact same way as you would an infant?
Also ich muss jetzt mal sagen, mal abgesehen von den ganzen ethischen Aspekten und was da eigentlich sofort, wo der logische Menschenverstand sagt, halt, stopp, muss man sagen, es ist ein interessanter Ansatz. Also es ist eine interessante Idee und man würde schon gerne wissen, was rauskommt bei so einem Experiment. Aber natürlich, zu welchem Preis ist dann halt das Problem.
Would the chimpanzee's development change, or maybe would it even begin to act like a human? He had been planning the concept of a comparative experiment during his postgraduate days at Columbia when studying for his master's in 1927. Kellogg during this time was fascinated with accounts of feral children living with wolves.
Gibt's das?
He believed that the infants learned to live like wolves because that was what their environment demanded of them. Thus, if the tables were turned, with a wild animal could nurture overall heredity and even humanize it,
Aber eigentlich müsste man ja schon wissen, dass das nicht klappt, weil nicht umsonst wurden ja Hunde über Jahrhunderte domestiziert und Katzen. Weil wenn das einfach so beim ersten geklappt hätte, dann hätte man die ja gar nicht richtig domestizieren müssen. Dann könnten wir ja noch heute mit Wölfen leben.
The birth of Kellogg's first child offered a unique opportunity, and that was to comparatively raise the child alongside a primate. Kellogg devised, if he could raise a chimp with Donald, their son, like siblings, he could then see the nature differences. The chimp
Ja, und früher hat man sich halt auch gedacht, ja, das ist ja nur ein Affe. Und ich meine, das ist doch süß. Wenn wir mit dem zusammenleben, ist doch toll. Da frage ich mich natürlich auch direkt, was wurde mit den ganzen so Exkrementen und so gemacht? Affen gehen ja nicht so klassisch auf Klo und sowas.
chimpanzee wouldn't be a pet, but treated in the exact same way as the human child. They would be fed by bottle, bathed, clothed, handled, and pushed around in a pram. It would be induced to walk upright, the same as a child, and would be corrected in its mistakes, like a human as well.
Auf jeden Fall sehen wir schon mal, dass es massive Tierquälerei ist.
The chimpanzee
Das sind Affen-NFTs, genau, die sind daraus entstanden. Das riechst du so richtig, Schubi, 2020.
would also be taught and encouraged to eat with a spoon and to play like a child with children's toys. The primate would not be allowed to learn in any other way than the human way, thus allowing the experiment a chance to succeed in creating a human-acting chimp. In order to facilitate his experiment, Kellogg would seek help from Yerkes. He received the
jetzt wissen,
Social
was
Science
rauskommt.
Research Council Fellowship to work at the Yale Amphipod Station in Florida in order to prepare for his experiment in 1931. Needless to say, this would necessitate the Kellogg's family moving to Florida, and not long after, Goa the chimpanzee would join the family to start this bizarre experiment.
Oh Gott, das klingt alles so gruselig. Es gibt auch einen Film über das Experiment der Wolfsjunge. Ach krass, das wusste ich auch nicht. Ist der bei Wölfen aufgewachsen?
Goa and Donald were introduced at the ages of 7.5 and 10 months respectively in the summer of 1931. And in every
Oh je, mine, jetzt kommen die Bilder. Die Originalen.
conceivable way, the two were treated by Winthrop and Luella as if they were brother and sister. Straight away, the Kelloggs started noting the physical and behavioural differences between the two infants. The former was pretty easy, as the two were different
Oh, aber die sind beide voll süß. Davon mal abgesehen.
species of animals, and with Gua having longer arms than Donald and much greater physical abilities. Gua had nearly all of her teeth, whereas Donald only had 2.
Ja, ist ja auch logisch, weil Affen sich ja viel schneller entwickeln. Und auch ein viel kürzeres Leben haben.
To discover the differences, both physiologically and psychologically, of the two, Kellogg thought up some strange and somewhat cruel experiments. Kellogg took great interest in the differences in how the two's bone structures developed. To explore this, he tested the differences by sound, by hitting both Donald and Gua's head with a spoon, to
Oh,
try and
chillig.
hear a difference in the hardening of the skull.
Ah, chillig.
He found that
Erstmal mein Kind heute wieder schlagen für ein Experiment. Gar keinen Bock.
Donald's head radiated a dull thud, whereas Gua's made a harsher sound, hinting at the chimpanzee's bones being more hardened.
Hey, aber hatte man damals noch nie ein Affenskelett gesehen? Sind die dumm? Oder dachten die, das entwickelt sich dann gleich wie beim Menschen?
Bizarrely, Kellogg had previously x-rayed Gua and already knew her bone density was equal to that of a 2-year-old human. To ascertain the differences between the two's reaction times, the Kelloggs devised an interesting experiment. Both Donald and the chimpanzee were placed in front of a motion picture camera. This was to allow reviewing of the reactions later on. After the two had settled and the camera was recording, a revolver was fired in the air behind them. Both were startled
Was ist das für ein alt sind die denn? Ich meine, okay, also man muss das mal vielleicht auch einordnen. In den 1920ern war es auch, glaube ich, noch völlig normal, seine Kinder zu schlagen, oder? Was an sich auch schon vollkommen ekelhaft und undenkbar ist für uns heutzutage. Aber deswegen hatten die wahrscheinlich damit nichts am Hut. Aber wie schrecklich ist das? Aua.
And it was discovered that Guar reacted more quickly than her human sibling.
Oh nein, guck mal, der denkt jetzt so, oh, Papa hat den Affen im Arm und nicht mich. Oh mein Gott, ich finde das ganz schrecklich.
The experiment was repeated a few months later with 5 other children, ranging in age between 17 months and 8.5 years.
Warum nicht?
The basic day for the 2 test subjects consisted
wollten ja hier
of a 7 a.m. wake up with 7:30 a.m. breakfast. Then until 8:30 a.m. sit with the adults at the breakfast table. From 9 in the morning until lunch, the time would be filled out with controlled observations, car rides, outdoor and indoor play, photographing and various experiments. After lunch, at 12:15, nap time followed by a bath time. And between 15:30 and 1600, more experiments, observations, playtime and tests.
Allein das ist ja schon voll grausam. Stell dir mal vor, du wächst damit auf, dass du täglich irgendwelche Experimente über dich ergehen lassen musst. Egal ob als Affe oder als Mensch.
To end up the day at dinner at around 1800 hours, followed by bed at 18:30. The days were not always run strictly to this plan, as the Kellogg's had various different engagements.
Okay.
During the experiment's initial 2 weeks, Guar's reflex behaviour was recorded. An interesting behaviour was noted. The chimpanzee had issues in her balance after standing upright.
Ja, wahrscheinlich, weil es für Schimpansen nicht normal ist, aufrecht zu gehen, oder?
There were 2 conclusions that the Kellogg's family made about this. The first being due to her still not being fully developed. But the other conclusion was that she was becoming disorientated due to having to look up at her human observers more than if she was in the wild.
Oh, das ist ja auch so schlimm für den Affen. Das tut mir so leid.
Probably a bit of both, as this new environment would definitely have been confusing to her. Guar adapted very quickly to her new sleeping arrangements. A cot was constructed and was designed to be usable for an infant child with mattress, clean linens, and even night clothing. When this was temporarily removed, her reaction was predictable. She began to cry out in despair. Guar's reactions when sleepy were very characteristic of a human child. When picked up, she would try and cuddle up, and when sat up, her head would nod down, only to come back up startled by the motion. For the first 2 months, Guar napped more than Donald, mainly after meals, but as she got older, she slept less in a day, eventually getting to the 1 nap as outlined in the day schedule. Donald, on the other hand, was sleeping 2 or more hours in the afternoon nap time.
Ja, der Typ, der musste auch einiges verarbeiten in seinem Schlaf.
Guar slept during the night without issues throughout the experiment, something that from experience isn't something that a human child often does. But as the experiment progressed, she started to make a nest with her bedding, a thing that chimpanzees do in the wild with twigs in trees.
Oder sieht man's, der Instinkt kommt durch. Wildtiere sind am Ende halt einfach Wildtiere. Eine Sache, die viele Rapper in ihren Musikvideos noch nicht gecheckt haben.
She hadn't seen anyone else do this, and thus showed the behaviour was possibly hereditary, or could be perceived as an infant playing in their bed in the night. Throughout the experiment, both subjects were observed during their physical development. Donald had a walking age stroller. This was because human infants don't develop walking until at least 10 months. Guar,
Wie der auch die ganze Zeit da so gezogen wird. Ich finde das ganz schrecklich.
on the other hand, could walk by the time she was with the Kellogg's. She also had a stroller, but she used it as a toy instead of a walking aid. Interestingly, Guar was beginning to mimic the way humans walk, adopting a more upright posture.
Aha, also dann doch. Ein bisschen
The
abgeguckt.
chimp was showing much quicker level of development as Donald for the age. The experiment continued to observe the differences between the two in the way they interacted with their environment. During the toddler months of childhood, the beginnings of reading and language start to develop. Part of this is the ability to point at things that interest the infant, and Guar exhibited these behaviours as well.
Oha. Das heißt, der Affe hat auch auf Dinge gezeigt.
The 2 infants,
Machen die das in der... Obwohl, machen Affen das in der Wildnis?
almost right from the start of the experiment, seemed to enjoy each other's company, with Donald showing great delight in interacting with his new sister. Guar would hold out hands to Donald, stroking her hair. As the experiment progressed, it seemed like the 2, especially Guar, had become attached to each other, always making a beeline for him when he entered the room, and noticeably got more excited when playing with Donald.
Oh Gott, die haben sich dann echt wie so Geschwister gesehen.
If Guar was admonished for doing something wrong, Donald would go up to her and hug the chimpanzee. As Donald's speech developed, he was able to even say his sister's name.
Sister, wie der es auch übernimmt. Oh Gott, voll schlimm. Lass mich raten, am Ende ist der Affe gestorben und der Typ hat dann gleichzeitig noch eine Existenzkrise bekommen.
When another older child called Martha was introduced, Guar behaved similarly by hugging the 3.5-year-old, smelling her hair and holding her hand. Interestingly, Guar was much more reserved and timid around human adults, which to me sounds very similar to how a human child may act, loud and excited with their peers, but quiet and shy around adults. Guar's actions around new adults was even more shy and even at some times seemed fearful.
Ja, also, das ist ja auch kein Wunder, oder? Wenn ich in so einem Experiment wäre, dann hätte ich auch ordentlich Angst vor erwachsenen
The
Menschen.
pair's interactions with other animals was characteristically childlike as well, with Guar stroking the next door neighbour's cat and having seemingly no fear in approaching adult dogs, much like a human child. But this would change at the age of 11 months, when a
Das ist interessant, weil Tiere ja grundsätzlich schon eher Angst haben vor
puppy barked
sowas.
at her after she had mistakenly taken the dog running as a game of tag. From then on, she became scared of almost all other animals, including
Ja.
chickens, cats, and even birds in the trees.
Das macht ja auch Sinn, weil Tiere ja viel mehr darauf angewiesen sind, Angst vor anderen Tieren zu haben, weil sie die ja nicht unterdrücken können in dem Sinne, wie, also unterdrücken oder beherrschen können, wie Menschen es können.
Guar's emotional responses to being admonished or punished for any number of minor
Wobei natürlich Kinder auch Angst bekommen können, wenn sie einmal von einem Hund gebissen werden oder so, dann haben sie ja auch oft danach Angst vor Hunden.
behavioural infractions elicited an interesting response. She would noticeably become distressed, and then approach the experimenters for affection or a kiss, as a form of forgiveness for committing the faux pas. This is a similar type of behaviour seen in children, but comes on later in social development at around 18 to 24 months. This showed that Guar was developing faster emotionally than Donald, and that she was learning very human-like behaviours. She had mastered
oder?
opening doors, especially a swinging door, a month before Donald. At the age of 1 year, Guar had figured out that light switches controlled the electric light bulbs. As such, when an adult put their hand up to the switch, Guar would look at the light in anticipation of its illumination.
Affen sind generell so smart, davon mal abgesehen, also von diesem Experiment mal ganz abgesehen. Finde ich das so schrecklich, dass man die einfach in Käfige steckt und die begafft werden müssen von Menschen und genau checken, was da mit ihnen gemacht wird. Das ist doch einfach gemein.
The experimenters attempted to teach both how to play patty cake. Donald picked it up rather quickly and with little prompts happily followed the
Ich
game.
weiß nicht, was Patty-Cake
Guar, on the
ist.
other hand, never learned how to play properly, even though she was given daily opportunities to practice. The two subjects also underwent potty training. Guar had more accidents than Donald and was seemingly embarrassed when she made them.
Das dachte ich mir nämlich auch schon fast, dass die das nicht so hinkriegt mit dem auf Toilette gehen als Affe.
Eventually, she would indicate that she wanted to go to the toilet by oohing and holding her genital area. This would develop to her going to an experimenter and indicating by tugging on the adult's trousers. Throughout the experiment, both of the subjects were given the opportunity to use
Both of the subjects. Einfach ein Baby und ein Affe.
the spoon. Like many other observations, the Kellogg's saw that Guar was way ahead in proficiency than Donald. By 13 months, she was using the spoon for self-feeding, with little mess, in contrast to Donald, who had mastered the skill by around 18 months. Another test was devised where a reward was placed behind a wire mesh attached to a door frame. The only way to get to the reward is via the use of a hoe to drag it under a small gap in the
No.
mesh. Although both figured out the solution at around 100 attempts, Guar proved to be more consistent in her success rate. The Kellogg's wanted to probe into a vital part of the human experience next, and that was something that makes us unique: language.
Wollten die dem auch noch Sprechen beibringen? Aber da weiß man ja heutzutage, das geht, glaube ich, gar nicht, allein aufgrund der Stimmbänder.
This part is where Guar would fall behind, and Donald would develop some strange new behaviours. Guar's language development differed to that of a human child, in the sense that she would communicate her wants physically, like pointing to her mouth for food. As we saw with her potty training, the need to empty her bowels was indicated non-verbally. This was the same for when she wanted to play, by grabbing one or both hands of her intended playmate. She would also pull experimenters' hands to items she needed help with.
Du bist ja auch logisch, wenn die nicht sprechen können.
The vocal
Eigentlich müsste man dem dann, wenn man das richtig machen würde, dann müsste man versuchen, dir Zeichensprache beizubringen.
communication Guar achieved was limited to oohs, ahs, and grunts. This is where Donald exceeded, as almost from the start of the experiment he was attempting to vocalise his emotions and needs. This would develop into vocalising actual words, a feat Gua failed to reach. But something rather worrying began to become apparent in Donald, in that his speech became stunted. This is likely due to his lack of socialising outside the experimental setting, and as such, failed to pick up words discovered by interaction of one's peers.
Oh, wahrscheinlich durfte der auch kaum rausgehen wegen dem Experiment und kaum mit anderen Kindern spielen, weil man wollte ja so clean wie möglich das Experiment halten. Schrecklich.
He was only in possession of around 6 words, but he did show signs of vocal imitation, although not from his human carers, but instead from his chimpanzee sister. The Kellogg's noticed Donald barking like a dog to communicate certain emotions. The child would also screech, scream, and even ooh like an ape.
Oh Gott, ich habe das Gefühl, das geht nicht gut aus.
Gua, although not learning to speak words herself, did learn the words spoken to her. Initially, she would react just to the tone of the way the words were spoken, but she began to show signs of being able to differentiate between different commands. Initially, she would react to no and kiss, but her word reaction vocabulary eventually expanded to around 95 words, including the ability to point out parts of her anatomy when asked. Donald, from the start of the experiment, was slow to learn commands, but this is probably attributable to his lower mobility compared to...
Aber überleg dir auch mal einfach als Kind, wie random das ist. Normalerweise ist ja eins der wichtigsten Sachen, die Eltern Kindern geben müssen, Affection, also Beschäftigung mit dem Kind. Und stell dir mal vor, deine Eltern sind die, die sich nur mit dir beschäftigen im Sinne von einem Experiment. Also natürlich, also selbst wenn der Affe nicht dabei gewesen wäre, geht das scheiße aus für das Kind. Also selbst wenn die Eltern einfach nur das Kind nur in einem Experimentsetting großziehen würden, geht das nicht auf, weil du brauchst ja diese zwischenmenschliche Interaktion.
Gua. Once he was more
Zuneigung, genau.
proficient with climbing and walking, he would overtake his sister. Donald's apparent social and vocal issues caused concern by the 9th month of the experiment in Luella, and as such, the experiment was abruptly brought to an end.
Ach.
Gua was evicted from a human household and sent back to Robert Yerkes.
Och, chillig! Man hat das Experiment einfach abgebrochen und den Affen zurück. Perfekt! Wahrscheinlich zurück zu den anderen Affen. Da wurde der doch safe gelyncht. Das verstehen die doch gar nicht, wenn sich ein Affe so anders verhält.
On the 28th of March 1932. From there, she would be the subject of a number of other experiments conducted by Robert's wife, Ada.
Auch gut.
But what of all the data collected from the study? And what was the result of the 9-month ape and baby
Ja,
experiment?
nix wahrscheinlich.
Well, the Kellogg's, now back to being a conventional family, moved back to Indiana, and the couple set about writing a book and publishing their study. Winthrop's results showed that he was disappointed that Gua had hit a wall of development. He had generally hoped that immersing the ape into the human household would have created the reverse of a wild raised by wolves child. It's undeniable that Gua did develop many human-like behaviours, such
Oh, der Affe ist so süß.
as walking more upright, being relatively potty-trained, understanding a multitude of commands, and even showing off her problem-solving skills. Ultimately, Gua was limited by the fact that she was a chimpanzee, and that her heredity limited her ultimate ability of language. Essentially, nurture can only take you so far until nature catches up.
Mhm.
Initially, the experiment went public when the article was published in the American Psychological Journal. It was written in such a way as to appeal to as many people as possible. This, unsurprisingly, generated a lot of interest in the press at the time.
Ja, kein Wunder. Das ist ja heute noch interessant.
And by the time a full book was released in 1933, the study and its ease of accessibility resulted in polarising opinions. Many critics pointed out that Gua being pulled from her biological mother at such a young age and the suddenness of the ending of her adoption. This, no doubt, must have been very
Yeah.
traumatic for the young chimp, to be ripped twice from her perceived home.
Ja, das muss wohl sehr traumatisierend sein.
But the biggest criticism came from the use of Donald as a test subject. Understandable, after all, it was on Luella's insistence that the study be terminated. The extended period of 9
Chillig, erstmal das Kind so lange auf dem Stuhl drehen, bis es kotzt.
months in which Donald was used in the experiment resulted in his development being stunted. And needless to say, this brings up questions of the study being ethical. Especially
Ja, also ob diese Studie ethisch ist, das ist, glaube ich, keine Frage mehr, oder? Es macht doch auch keinen Sinn, dass Menschen großgezogen von Tieren besser funktionieren als andersherum. Ein Affe hat ja gar nicht die Kapazitäten. Stimmt, Marienziska. Das kann sein. Natürlich funktioniert das eher. Ja, macht Sinn.
when feasibly a child wasn't
Ich würde so gerne wissen, wie das Empfinden des Kindes war. Ja, das wäre jetzt interessant, wenn er jetzt erwachsen geworden wäre, dann könnte man es ja wissen heutzutage, aber ich wette, der ist früh gestorben.
even needed for Gua to be raised with humans. A number of the tests throughout the study were questionable, where the child was frustrated in the broom experiment, hit on the head, and startled with the gun. But how did the subjects fare later on in life? Well, unfortunately, both participants' lives would end in tragedy.
Oh.
Greer would die of pneumonia on December 21st, 1933, less than a year after she left the Kellogg's family,
Traurig.
just after turning 3 years old. Donald would live to the age of 43, when, in 1973, he took his own life.
Das heißt, er kann ja schon mal was dazu gesagt haben, theoretisch. Aber da scheint er dann wohl vielleicht schon damals, also man weiß natürlich nie, ne, warum sich jemand das Leben nimmt, aber es könnte natürlich schon in der eigenen Kindheit liegen in dem Fall. Ne? Im Studium meine ich gelernt zu haben, dass Ethikkommissionen erst Jahrzehnte später eingeführt wurden. Ja, kann gut sein.
In all respects, he had grown up healthy, studying medicine and specialising in psychiatry.
Ach, okay.
Whether his upbringing had contributed to his demise, we will never know. Llewellyn and Winthrop would pass away in 1972. Now, where would you rate this experiment on my ethical scale?
Oh Gott.
I'm going to give it about a 5 or a 6.
Von was? Eine 5 oder 6 von was? Ist 10 ganz ethisch oder ist 10 ganz unethisch? Oder ist es überhaupt von 1 bis 10? Also sagen wir mal, wenn 0 komplett ethisch und okay ist und 10 ist total unethisch, also nee, das macht keinen Sinn, wir machen es andersrum. 0 ist total unethisch und 10 ist ethisch korrekt. Also jetzt sagen wir mal einfach ein Experiment, was man ohne Tiere und alles machen würde. Einfach nur irgendwelche Bakterienstämme zählen. Dann würde ich mal sagen, wäre es von der Ethischheit mäßig schon eine 1 oder 2. Also so unethisch, oder? Habt ihr meine Skala verstanden? Keine Ahnung. Ach, das war das Video. Okay, gut. Interessant. Ich habe ehrlich gesagt vorher nie von diesem Experiment gehört. Ich finde es ziemlich schrecklich. Ja. Oh mein Gott, der macht nur solche Videos. Ist ja crazy. Ja, der Mensch, der hat schon... Der Mensch ist schon ein ekliges Säugetier teilweise.